when I began to look at myself, I began to see the traits that I had picked up from her
Yes,
and
yes,
where I could make some changes
yes.
in my behavior and who I was.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In the last episode, I shared a clip from my conversation for the upcoming online event, Trusting After Trauma, Redefining Relationships After Parental Narcissistic Abuse, hosted by Pi Venus Winslow. This free event brings together more than 15 professionals focused on helping individuals rebuild trust and create healthier relationships after childhood trauma, narcissistic abuse, and codependency. Today, I want to share a second clip from that conversation. In this segment, we move beyond identifying the impact of covert narcissistic parenting and begin looking more closely at how these early dynamics become internalized, how they shape one's sense of self, autonomy, guilt, and emotional reality well into adulthood. As I often see in my clinical work, the legacy of a covert narcissistic parent is not always dramatic or obvious. It lives in the subtle erosion of self trust, in the confusion around one's emotional reactions, and in the quiet ways a person learns to, and I quote, shrink. Pi tells us when she's recollecting her own childhood experiences that she would shrink in order to preserve connection. In this clip, we explore those micro moments, the seemingly neutral exchanges that leave a child feeling blamed, unseen, or emotionally alone, and how those experiences organize adult relationships. This is the second teaser from that interview. If what you hear resonates with you, I encourage you to register for the full event. The link is in the show notes below. Let me take you right into this next part of the conversation, and I'll meet you on the other side again for a brief reflection on what we just heard.
In your clinical work, what begins to shift when that confusion starts to lift and a person begins to recognize that discomfort that they've been carrying is generated within the relationship, right? Not because there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, so there are two parts to this. And just for people who are listening or watching, Pi and I were having a discussion off air before we went on. And she said, I'm very excited to hear what you're going to say about this. And I said, well, not everybody listening may be so excited. And this is the part, so please bear with me, okay? Well, a number of things for that shift, right, to happen, a number of things are going on. But just for the sake of time, I'll just focus on that one word that I introduced a little bit earlier, which is mentalization. But mentalization works in two ways. One is the capacity to think about somebody else's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So that automatically gives you some space. So that's already beginning a process of separation from somebody else. So the second part of mentalization is to be able to reflect on your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. See, because at some point, this cannot be just about my covert narcissistic mother. That's like blaming the parent. And you're an adult now, you see, and we have to help you begin to take some responsibility for the pressure that you feel to be there for this covert narcissistic parent. So it's like a two-pronged approach. One is, yes, of course, recognizing all the traits and dynamics and characteristics that go along when you have this kind of parent. But the second part, and this is usually where people get stuck, Pi, is that's the more introspective piece, is to really be able to recognize that a lot of this, unfortunately, has been internalized. It's inside of me, and I carry this with me. So when your mother does make some kind of flat comment like, okay, or something like that in terms of good news, the focus is not then just on your mother's response, which we could start there because you always want to validate first. But the second response is, how did it land with you? And I wonder why it landed with you in that way. In other words, there must already be a feeling inside of you that you're doing something wrong. that this lands in such a hard way that you end up leaving that conversation feeling a bit deflated. Or that other example I gave where the woman said, my engine starts running, that already implies something complicated is going on in you. It's not just the interpersonal dynamic, it's also intrapsychic. Something is happening inside. And we need to look at that as well for that shift to continue and for that space, so that you could get some space from this kind of parent.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up because that was certainly the case with me
Mhm.
and my journey. The first part was like, okay, I figured out what's going on with my mother and I'm having all the feelings about it. And I'm pointing the finger and yes, 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 it's all true.
Yep.
These things happened and yes, it hurt me and yes, I was a victim because I was a child. And then what? Right?
Yes.
How do I actually get rid of this
Yeah.
yuckiness, right? And it's like, oh, I have to get rid of the yuckiness. I have to do something. This is
Yeah.
where that's the responsibility part. And I was angry,
Hmm.
Dr. Anthony. I was angry
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had to work hard at, figuring all of this stuff out when it wasn't even my fault that it happened. I was very
Yeah.
resentful of kind of learning how to do this internal mentalization that you're talking
Yeah.
about. But
And what do you do
once
with the anger, Pi? What do you do? Do you bring it back to the parents? So when they're insensitive or they're criticizing or they put you down in subtle ways with, backhanded compliments, for instance,
Mhm.
do you let them have it? Do you call them out? Like, what do you do with that anger?
Well, I actually don't have contact with my mother anymore.
I see.
And I haven't for many, many years. That is my boundary because I
Right.
already know, like, there's no way that we can have a relationship anymore. It's
People,
sad.
many people do that. Listen, it's not so uncommon. And again, in social media and the content that's out there, this is a very, very, very typical recommendation, boundaries and no contact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was hard. I mean, I had to do a lot of grieving. I was saying, this relationship is over. But
Yeah.
once it was over, it created that space for me to feel
Mm,
safe enough to do this inner reflection and to separate myself from her and recognize like there actually is not, like I'm not a bad person, even
yes.
though I got the message that I was.
Mm,
And ooh, here's where it gets really
yes.
juicy is that when I began to look at myself, I began to see the traits that I had picked up from her
Yes.
and
Yeah.
where I could make some changes
Yes.
in my behavior and who I was.
Well, let me highlight that. Let me highlight that because you said this is where it gets juicy. And this is such a typical part of the deeper work that I do with my patients is oftentimes we discover the covert narcissism in the parent first in the patient. So in other words, you end up, many of the children of these parents end up with their own, to your point, covert narcissistic characteristics that they're not even aware of because everything is about look at what kind of mother I have,
Right.
not look at how I'm behaving.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was very humbling.
Hmm. Of course, because it's so much more comfortable to look at it in somebody else, right? Or to have an intellectual understanding of something. But when you actually see it again in those micro moments in real life, how you're treating somebody, and it's like, where does something like this come from? Where did you learn? It's like, oh, this is my mother. This is exactly what my mother does to me. It's
Yep.
like, yeah, so in order to stay close, and we don't pathologize this, by the way, no way, because this is part of what keeps this thing alive is that's a deep connection that you had with your mother. You see, an identification is a way of taking somebody in, but that's a form of connection. So
Mhm.
this is a way, one way that you could stay connected with your mother is you are like her, you see, and that's not pathology, that's an attachment, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, it's a long and, layered journey. And I know people who are tuning in, we're all at our different places, right? It's like
Yeah.
some people are still like in that place where I was, just blaming my parent. Maybe don't have the support or the help to look, beyond that and start getting into the more of the healing aspects. And then there are people who are, who are much further along who maybe still are struggling. There's still a little something there that they haven't quite gotten through.
Well,
That's something they're
those are the
still
micro,
struggling with.
that's the unconscious part.
Hmm.
Those are the micro moments. And to your point, like, yeah, people are at different places in their journey. And depending on where you are, who's ever listening, it's like, all right, so if you're at the point where you could say, eventually, eventually at some point, recognizing this in my mother, which is important. That's such an important first step, right? But it stops being therapeutic or healing at a certain point as well. And that's when sometimes that deeper work comes in, which is unconsciously, what do I do to reenact this relationship? Or how can I not allow myself? And this is a question I raise with people, like, what would it be like for you to take pleasure still in your engagement, right? Like, in other words, what would that mean to you to make a choice if you want to dine in or dine out? What do you imagine would happen if you made the choice and didn't turn it over to your husband or your boyfriend? And that's where you start getting into the deeper layers of all of what that means to them, which is the fantasy, by the way, which is what? Either I'm going to hurt them or they're going to hurt me if I act too autonomously, right? What often keeps someone stuck is not simply fear of separation, it is unconscious loyalty, emphasizing the word loyalty. A loyalty to the internalized parent. Remember, that's the image of the parent's voice that you carry around inside of yourself well into adulthood. There's a loyalty to this internalized parent who cannot tolerate differentiation. Autonomy doesn't just feel dangerous, it feels like you are being disloyal. It's a betrayal. This is why, in part, for many who decide to go, and I quote, no contact, this does not necessarily leave them with a deeper feeling of freedom and autonomy over their life. I have found in my own clinical work with the adult children of narcissistic parents that a deeper terror is this: if I am truly free to enjoy my life, will I be abandoned? Or will I become the abandoning one? That I will be the selfish one? Will I be the narcissistic one, the bad one? So instead of fully separating, yes, despite going no contact, oftentimes the individual splits off parts of themselves. Desire still may get muted, and assertiveness may turn into anxiety. This is just one path. And over time, something subtle may happen. As Pi mentioned in her own personal journey, they may begin to exhibit their own covert narcissistic traits: hypersensitivity, withdrawal, moral superiority, quiet resentment. The main point that Pi and I spoke about in some detail was how the real prison is not the parent. It is the internal prohibition against becoming fully separate. And yes, that's something that the adult child carries with them. It's the voice inside that equates autonomy with cruelty and joy or happiness with betrayal. Until that internal object, that internal representation of the condemning, devaluing, covert narcissistic parent is examined and metabolized, you remain psychologically entangled, negotiating every choice as if love, connection is always on the line. Anyway, there is still much more that we covered in that interview, so I encourage you to check out the full conversation, along with the other professionals in terms of what they have to say. Because remember, I mentioned there are about 15 other professionals who are going to comment and reflect on these complicated relationships with these narcissistic parents. So I'm looking forward to registering for the full event. I hope you do as well. The link is in the show notes below. Okay, until next time, bye for now.